Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. We're coming to you live from the Singapore FinTech Festival, and joining me for this segment, we have Saad Ahmed. He's head of APAC at Gemini. We're here to discuss crypto adoption trends in Asia, trends, barriers, and Gemini's roadmap. Saad, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to TradeTalks.
Thank you for having me, Jill.
You got it. What trends are you seeing in terms of crypto adoption across the region here as compared to the US, as an example?
Yeah, so to be perfectly honest, I think the trends I would break it up into two parts. So if you look at the US, a lot of the products that we have out here in Asia, things like derivatives for crypto, etc., are not available to US customers, right? And so we launched a derivative exchange last year, which is a non-US product. And I think that's one of the big differences that we see out here. So we see adoption of those kind of products, which is primarily driven outside the US. There's markets like Singapore and Hong Kong that are also, from a regulatory perspective, they're regulating crypto in a very different way, and they're a bit forward-thinking, I would say, in terms of coming up with clear guidelines around consumer protection, regulation, and as a result of that, you see sort of this ecosystem getting concentrated in markets like this. So a lot of builders, a lot of developers in these markets. So I would say that's a big trend that you see out here in Asia, where you can see people are building, people are setting up, people are building new projects and new use cases, and I think that's kind of the big differences we see between what's happening in the US and what's happening here. And I think the energy here, as you can see, is massive.
I think part of the issue there is too, you're trying to bucket it into, is it an equity, is it a commodity, when in fact perhaps it is its own thing that requires its own framework. Different conversation. So in your view, when you think about the biggest barrier to crypto adoption, what do you think can be done from an educational standpoint for people that are curious?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question, and of course something that we think about all the time, because that's a segment that we want for more and more people to be educated about it, right? And so I would say the biggest barrier to adoption is the fact that there's this narrative that it's illegal in some countries, there's no regulation, it's kind of the Wild West, right? And when in fact, in reality, and I used to work in the ride-hailing industry, so I set up Uber's business and Grab's business, not too long ago, those services were illegal, right, in many cities around the world. And now when you go to a city and you realize that Uber or Grab doesn't exist, right? You're like, oh, how am I going to get around, right? And so innovation actually leads regulation in many respects. And I think having clear regulatory framework is actually a big step, and a consistent regulatory framework. So part of the problem is every jurisdiction kind of regulates in a different way, but having a clear, consistent regulatory framework, I think is one of the big sort of blockers to adoption. And I think once we solve for that, I think you will see adoption. Of course, there's other sort of problems to solve for, which could be, how do we, fixing payments and things like that. But I would say the fundamental one is really around, consistent regulatory framework that people can get behind.
Well, of course, I mean, you know how to operate, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about it in those terms, give us a glimpse into Gemini's roadmap for the particular region. What are some of the key milestones that you're working towards, and are there any developments that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, so just to share, I mean, we announced last week we received the in-principle approval from the Monetary Authority of Singapore for our Singapore business. That's been in the works for several years, so really happy about that. I joined Gemini at the end of last year. My focus has really been threefold. One, out here in Asia to build a core leadership team. So I've been focused on building out our leadership team here. And so over the last 6 or so months, we've hired a new general counsel, new head of compliance, new head of strategy, new head of institutional sales. So that's, the leadership team for Gemini here in APAC is now very well rounded out. The other one was obviously around the licensing, and so this is a very positive milestone towards getting our license from the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And the third was looking at expansion across the APAC region. So identifying which markets we want to focus on, and happy to share that we're in the process of setting up entities in a couple of different markets. We'll share more in due time, but we're setting up entities in a couple of different markets for driving Gemini's international expansion in the Asia-Pacific region.
All right, lots of exciting stuff on the horizon. Hope to hear about it at this time next year, of course. Appreciate the insights on. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. And thanks for joining me from the Singapore FinTech Festival. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.